On this episode of Booked on Rock, a journey through the revolutionary music from the man who is a master at using his art to challenge the status quo, Frank Zappa.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Bradley Morgan, he has returned to the show. It's been a while since he's been here. He was first on back in December of 2021 for his book U2's The Joshua Tree, Planting Roots in Mythic America. He is back this time to talk about his brand new book titled Frank Zappa's America. Great to have you back, Bradley. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Eric. Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
As you say in the book, so many different opportunities to approach Frank Zappa's music. He's had one of the most expansive and dense catalogs in popular music, over 60 albums during his lifetime, dozens more after his death. So talk about your approach to his music in this book and how exploring his least understood and represented work helped you to get a full understanding of his legacy.
Well, it's no exaggeration to say that I didn't understand this book until the moment I finished it. Certainly, in some ways, it's a bit of a spiritual successor to my previous book that you mentioned, U2's The Joshua Tree, but I wanted to kind of wrestle with Frank as, for me, the embodiment of the musical and cultural figure who risked the most for his communicating the ideas of participatory democracy or freedom of speech, freedom of expression. But he's also someone with a lot of major cultural baggage as well. And when I first was thinking about doing this book, I wanted to approach him as a political commentator, but I didn't quite have that narrative through line yet. And it was by really taking a look at this period in the 80s, actually from 79 with the release of Joe's Garage to his death in 93, just exactly how he was kind of channeling his lyrics to be at first very indirect about who is causing a lot of the problems in American culture. And then as the decade went on, more direct, actually calling specific people out in songs. And when I was looking at the lyrics and the music that I'd grown up with, it was really at odds with the reputation that he had as someone who was, he was a provocative figure for sure, but there's lingering misunderstanding about his legacy that lumps him as being a racist, a homophobe, a sexist, and I just didn't hear that. And through his lyrics and his commentary throughout that decade, he really exemplified a very progressive ideal, I think, at the heart of his music, and that's really what I wanted to get at. And that was a journey I didn't understand until literally the book was done, because of just the sheer volume of the work that he has and all of that baggage, and that this very complex, iconic musical figure was just reduced to a few different, pastiches of just his image. Great guitar player, provocative lyrics, freedom of speech advocate, but he was like so much more, and I wanted to hone in on that.
Can you talk about the Freedom Wall and how it relates to this book?
Yeah, so the Freedom Wall is this art installation in Chicago that went up in the early 90s by an art collective called Industry of the Ordinary, and one half of it is a man named Adam Brooks. He's a British man who was a professor at Columbia College at that time in Chicago. And around the 92 election, there's a lot of rhetoric about, I remember it so well being 4 years old at that time, but around the 92 election, from what I've read and come to understand, is there was a lot of rhetoric around freedom and the concept of like fighting for freedom and, what makes us free as Americans. This is very amorphous idea. And so he wanted to take that idea and truly explore what freedom meant to different people. So the Freedom Wall, imagine a huge, like 72-foot tall vertical black banner that runs on the outside of an entire building. And there's just a list of names in white Helvetica font just going down throughout the entire thing. And these names were compiled through this process where Adam was reaching out to various people, either like directly over phone calls or at that time, early iterations of message boards or email, to ask people who are figures that represent the idea of freedom to you, whatever that may mean. And the list is based on the number of times those people were responded. Higher up the list, you have figures like George Washington, Jesus, the more universally accepted, maybe perhaps even a flawed figures, down to the lower bottom, figures that may not necessarily come up as often, but were very integral at that time. Elie Wiesel, Wilma Mankiller is on that list. Aung San Suu Kyi, who was won the Nobel Peace Prize around that time, but has since been ousted for committing a genocide in Burma after her house arrest. So it's meant to be at that time to capture this concept of freedom. And Frank Zappa is on that list. And what makes this kind of list bizarre is that it's just a list. There's no description of who these people are or why they're on there. Some names are more familiar than others, but this list had always kind of fascinated me. And I write about that piece of art in the introduction. It was actually the last thing I wrote for the book when I was trying to figure out how to tie all this together. And it really spoke to me in a lot of ways. And unfortunately, you can no longer see that art installation in between where you could visibly see the work from like the L train on the side of the building. A parking structure has gone up in its place. That happened over COVID. So it's covering the entire piece. There's only like a few inches in between in the buildings, and part of it kind of sticks out for a bit. But I wish I had known about that because I probably would have added that detail in the book. But I got to meet the artist when I gave him a copy of this book to tell him how much that piece meant to me, and he'd show me some photographs of the construction going up. And I'd asked him, did he ever think about taking it down or preserving it? And he goes, well, it's hard to take down a 70-foot tall banner, and also it adds a depth of meaning to the piece, that here is a list of people who represent freedom in some way, but now it's being covered. And it's kind of like he sees it now as like an allegory to what's happening in the country right now.
June 27th, 1966, the debut album by Frank Zappa's band Mothers of Invention was released. You call it an intrepid and uncompromisingly artistic debut album. You add, quote, he uses the album as a platform to mock American popular culture and the artificially pliable divisions in society that define and shape it. I want to ask you about the track, Who Are the Brain Police? Who's he referring to, and what did Frank have to say about the song when asked about it?
So the brain police is this concept that Frank had about people in society at that time who, one of the biggest criticisms against Zappa as a commentator is just a type of cynicism and callousness that he might have for a certain member of the American populace. And for him, he felt a lot of people who were victims of American culture self-victimize themselves. And the brain police is that kind of internal self-policing that we all do because we want to, make sure that we are staying within the guidelines of what's socially acceptable, whether, it's in a normal society or in a fascistic society. And there's one way that a lot of elements of fascism are able to creep in is because we do police ourselves. And so at a time when it's during the Johnson administration, several years after the Kennedy assassination, and that kind of future idealism that the early 60s had kind of inspired was making way for this something that was more paranoid, more authoritarian, and that was his way of capturing it, that a huge chunk of our path there is going to be driven by our own actions or limiting our own actions.
Zappa released 8 studio albums between 1966 and 1969. That's amazing. Absolutely Free, 1967. 3 albums in 1968 were Only in It for the Money, Lumpy Gravy, Cruising with Reuben and the Jets. Another 3 in 1969, Mother Mania, Uncle Meat, and Hot Rats. As you get into the late 60s and the height of the counterculture movement, Zappa, you say, continued to release albums with varying degrees of conceptual themes and ideas. What were those themes and ideas during that time period?
Well, the crux of the book mainly, and why my motivation for writing it, was purely to focus on the years from 79 to 93. And the reason why was because albums and compositions released at that time were addressing the rise of evangelical Christianity's influence in American politics. In 79, you had Jerry Falwell and the founding of the Moral Majority that mobilized this voting bloc to then elevate Ronald Reagan to the White House, and 8 years, 2 terms of governing the country with a televangelist at his ear. And the reason why I wanted to go in that direction was because his commentary is very relevant now, as we see a major political party has been co-opted by a far-right evangelical movement. But I even just only covering that, it was going to paint an incomplete picture of Frank because by focusing on this period and wanting to highlight the least known part of his career to elevate his relevancy, one aspect of that was that I needed to demonstrate that a lot of the values that he had been long held throughout his life. And while the book's main focus is on 79 through 93, there is that introductory chapter that goes into the first three Mothers of Invention albums from the 60s. And, his kind of dip of doing largely socially conscious work in the 70s, that's where he gets a lot of his reputation for his guitar work or even some of his lyrics. But those first three albums are really trying to address a conservative counter-revolution that was the predecessor to what we see in the late 70s with Falwell and the rise of Reagan. And this one was very much that kind of resistance to Johnson's Great Society, a lot of the values that Kennedy had proposed, and that kind of propelled progressive liberal ideas in America. These are the kind of ideas that formed out of Barry Goldwater and kind of just weren't original. They had roots in a lot of early America First movements in the early 20th century, but those albums were meant to address that particular ideology and what feeds it. And oftentimes, in Frank's view, what feeds it is a type of control on the culture. And by the end of the 60s, you have Vietnam, you have a lot of other things, you have a whole new decade that's coming on. And even Frank, I'm sure, is wanting to move on. And so throughout the 70s, you kind of had this dip in albums that had a very large narrative that focused on that. And instead, just random compositions or songs peppered throughout. And it's curiously also, the decade that really cements his reputation. But in order to tell that story about his work in the late 70s throughout the 80s, I needed to show that this wasn't just a coming to Jesus moment for him, so to speak, that this was something that he felt there was a return of something he had recognized a decade before.
And he was very active in the 70s, if my math is correct, 21 studio albums. And on his 1974 album, Apostrophe, there's a track called Uncle Remus. And on this track, you write that it stands out for showcasing how Zappa continued to observe the failures over America's struggle to absolve itself of its original sin. He's addressing civil rights here?
Yes, he's addressing civil rights and a lot of systemic racism that has underpinned a lot of American society. That track, Uncle Remus, in 74, I want to rewind it back because in 66, on the first Mother's album, Freak Out, there's the track Trouble Every Day, which is a kind of response to the media's handling of the Watts riots and what happened. And for those who may not be familiar with what happened was that there were a couple of black men in the Watts neighborhood who were beaten by police, and it had escalated to a very large situation that involved millions of dollars in damage, a lot of injuries, a couple deaths, and it was a major turning point in that movement. And it caused a lot of trauma, not only just that community, but in the song, Zappa's recognition that there's a particular type of American, specifically a white American, who may see the media's handling of this and find doubt in progressive ideas or progressive policies that are meant to elevate everyone to a good standard of living. And we kind of, see that we've kind of seen that now over the last couple of years. I write about in the book how the Black Lives Matter protests and the protests surrounding the murder of George Floyd kind of inspired the same kind of reaction. Like, well, look at these terrible liberal cities that are burning down. We can't have that, and that's the attitude that's being adopted by people who aren't there, who are only seeing a particular one-sided view in the media. That was in 66. And then with Uncle Remus, the lyrics were written by Zappa, but the music was written by George Duke, who was a very influential and amazing black keyboardist who was in Zappa's touring band at that time. And it's a song that recognizes, albeit from Zappa's perspective as a white man, the particular failures of the civil rights movement, kind of eschewing real progress for capitalism, for fashion, for commodities. And it's a very striking song and somber in some ways. And it ends with just Zappa going to, a rich person's house and knocking the lawn jockeys off the lawn, as this symbol of this kind of ugliness in America's past. And that's one of his more well-known tracks, certainly one of his more well-known tracks in the 70s, but it's one that stands out that kind of highlights a social consciousness in his thinking and in his lyrics that I think has really been overlooked.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
During our brief intermission, let's take a flying trip from the land of fantasy to everyday life.
Zappa railed against the media throughout his career. And there's a song released as a single in 1973. It's from his album Overnight Sensation, I'm the Slime. Talk about the song and the clues that he drops at the open.
Well, it's a song where lyrically Zappa is trying to play a guessing game with the listener. You know, he says things like, I'm gross and I'm perverted, I'm obsessed and deranged. And by this time, Zappa kind of had earned a bit of a reputation with some people as being this kind of weird, gross out guy. So you might think that he's talking about himself. But what he's ultimately talking about is the media that we consume at that time on our television sets that really, in his mind, played an influential role in how people think and go about their lives. And you are what you watch in essence. And I think that's it was something that really stuck in his craw for a long time, because there was a lot of other songs that he kept recording that specifically addressed how media as an institution, as a cultural institution, arm of society, of government, can be used as propaganda or to influence a particular way of thinking. And for him at that time in the 70s, it was to address mass consumerism, mass commercialization, this weakening of American culture and infrastructure. Not quite yet. There are some lyrics about the role that government plays in media, but he hadn't quite robustly developed that more thoroughly until later on. As the 70s make way to the 80s, and you have the arrival of MTV and the impact that had on radio airplay, as well as the deregulation of the Telecommunications Act that oversaw consolidation of media companies and the lessening of diverse voices in media.
He approaches sex with humor in some songs. Others, he broaches the topic in difficult and uncomfortable ways. Can you talk about that?
Oh, yeah. Sometimes, some of the songs, when he does approach sex, there is a type of commentary that is there. Certainly when the arrival of MTV happened and you had music videos that in his mind exploited women, or, if you think about the 80s hair metal videos and how women were dressed, and he really didn't like that. So he did write some songs that kind of addressed that music video culture. One of them is sex, and it makes fun of a lot of those tropes. There's also other songs that touch upon that, but in more uncomfortable ways, such as he has a track called He's So Gay from the album Thingfish, and it was issued as a single. And the whole song is kind of makes fun of a gay character at the center of it, who is, in Zappa's mind, creating this homosexual character in order to be seen as viable in music video culture. And even at the end of the song, it ends with a reference to the culture clubs, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? That Zappa saying, well, the only way to get your music played on MTV is to dress really gay and do this. And that's a very, I'm sure at that time, a very outdated idea. And he was a complex man in that regard in trying to balance some of those bad ideas, but it didn't come from a bad place. And that was really at the heart. What I found in a lot of his lyrics is that even if what he was communicating was abrasive or not the most politically correct, that at the heart, there wasn't a meanness in what he was trying to say. And that can sometimes be very hard to get from his music because it is so layered and a lot of humor and a lot of in-jokes and references, but also I can understand why someone would not want to listen to that and have to go through so many recordings. But it was necessary for me to address those instances where Zappa failed as a commentator in order to highlight where he succeeded.
How did he handle criticism from the media?
Oh, not well. I mean, he hated journalists a lot, and he addressed that, and sometimes even directly in his music. Packard Goose from Joe's Garage, which Joe's Garage is a rock opera about a world where music is criminalized systemically through the Constitution. And he had written that album as a response to the Iranian Revolution and the Ayatollah banning music. And there's a track on there called Packard Goose, which the main character, Joe, who is trying to survive, who's a musician trying to survive in this world where music is being made illegal, that he sees music journalists as government whores. And there's even lyrics that I write about in the book where he states that they fillet their masters for shekels. And that's a really hard line to accept, and it was one I had to criticize because the media is something that for a lot of conspiracy theorists, is derided as being controlled by Jews, and that's a very dangerous stereotype. And it's worth not only addressing in his music in that song on itself, but in that year in '79, he also released the song Jewish Princess from the album Shake Your Booty, which was under fire by the Anti-Defamation League for being anti-Semitic. And those are the type of moments where his commentary on media is somehow blurring with his own personal grievances as an artist, as a person, and sometimes does not come out well.
Disco became so much part of pop culture as the decade moved into the second half, and while some artists embraced it, Zappa critiqued it. Talk about that and the musical caricatures that he explores, like on the song Dancin' Fool.
Oh yeah, he had several songs that were meant to address disco as a cultural nuisance, as this type of fad that was overtaking, I guess, what he more saw as serious music. Because for him, he was seeing the culture of disco as being filled with the same kind of vapid, self-absorbed people that he was criticizing in the hippie culture with the Mothers of Invention in the 60s, that this is how they had just moved on from being hippies to being dancing in the discos to eventually in the 80s becoming the yuppies. To him, it was all the same. I do have to say that as someone who lives in Chicago and is very well versed in disco demolition, that, and I don't go this into the book, but it's worth noting that at that time, a lot of criticism against disco was a critical response to gay and black subculture. Because certainly by the time, because disco had been around for a couple years at that time in the underground with artists such as Grace Jones. By the late '70s, as it became more of a fad, with things like Disco Duck, any kind of criticism really was just a kind of response to that oversaturation. For Zappa, I don't think the criticism against disco was born out of the same sexism or racism or homophobia that led to things like disco demolition, which I mentioned. That's the second time I mentioned it. For people who aren't familiar, disco demolition was a day in the White Sox stadium where people brought disco records to burn, and it became this huge mess and throng of violence and everything. And it was all started by this really tacky local DJ at that time. But for Zappa specifically, on songs like Dancing Fool and Disco Boy, it's addressing the people who make up that culture at the time that became a fad, this vapid nature of it.
He largely withdrew from making albums with overt political commentary in the '70s, but that would start to change by the end of the decade. Can you talk about the conservative counter-revolution that was starting to take shape again and how that would inspire Zappa to return to political commentary?
Yeah, so Zappa was very, last year I went to a concert where I saw a couple of Zappa alumni performing at a local club here in Chicago, Bobby Martin and Ray White. And Ray, I got to talk to him after the show, and Ray was telling me that he was somebody who grew up as the son of a preacher in rural Illinois, and we were talking about the book, and that because I was working on it at the time, as well as some of Frank's opinions on religion. And Ray had told me a story where there was a point where he was getting kind of uncomfortable saying some of these lyrics because for him, he came from a religious background, and he had expressed his concern to Frank about that. And Frank said, I don't hate religion. I don't like the people who exploit it for profit. And that's for him really was the driving force. He didn't care what you did or what you believed or who you wanted to pray to, as long as it didn't interfere with the rights of anyone else, especially through violence. It was fine by him. But by 79, well, before that, so back in 76, when he had Ford beat Reagan in the primary for the Republican National Convention and going up against Carter, there was at that time this burgeoning evangelical movement that was disappointed that someone like Carter could become president. And by the time 80 rolled around and Carter was having these difficulties with the economy, with the conflict in Iran, also, that Reagan was then ascended the ranks as being, the one who will carry this evangelical mission forward and legitimize it in a way that it hadn't been before, bringing it from the fringes to the mainstream part of this political party. And for him, that was incredibly dangerous because the people who were leading this were televangelists, were people who, like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Jimmy Swaggart, who were building media empires that were exploiting financially people who had real deep fears and concerns, who were looking for answers. And for them, it was to send money to some guy on TV. And that really, really bothered him. And especially as their chosen candidate was so successful in the presidency. And so as he was seeing this and as he was seeing what was happening in Iran, he saw ways in which systematically America could become this fascist theocracy like he was witnessing.
Bradley Morgan is the author of Frank Zappa's America. Zappa, he took some shots at pop culture in the 80s and found himself on the pop charts with a top 40 single, Valley Girl, in 1983. His daughter, Moon Unit, sings lead vocals, and he's addressing the vapidness of youth culture. And I wonder what Frank was thinking if he were to see teenagers dancing to this song at clubs. Do you think he found pleasure in the fact that the very people he's taking shots at are loving this song, having no idea that really they're the punchline of the joke?
Well, Frank was somebody who really, from my impression, and I can't speak for him because he has been dead for over 30 years, and I do make it a point in my book to not speak for him or not to hypothesize on what he would think. But my impression of him, in terms of how he viewed his music and the culture and his legacy, he was very dismissive of it. He goes, I'm just going to make music. It's going to be here and it's going to be gone. But, last night I was at, I mentioned the show I was at last year with Ray White and Bobby Martin. They came again last night at the same club. And it was just, in both times when I saw them last year and this year, they had a music school that was opened up for them that involved middle schools and teenagers all performing Zappa's music. And just, there's like the craziest 10-year-old kid just shredding on the guitar. And it just was really fascinating and doing a lot of deep cuts. And it really, that was a moment where I did think, I think he would absolutely love to see, the youth taking on his music and really giving it the serious consideration that it deserved. Now, with something like Valley Girl, the success of that as a pop single became a way for him to continue financing, doing the more serious music that he wanted to do. I think part of him was a little bit bothered that his biggest hit was kind of considered to be a novelty song, and even part of his legacy with a lot of even serious music critics, they still see him as just a novelty artist. Part of the reason why I wrote that book is to push against that. I don't think he was a novelty artist. I think he was a very sincere man in his work. But that song is also a bit complicated as well because his daughter Moon had released her memoir, Earth to Moon, last summer at the time when I was copy editing this book. And in that, she tells the story about how that song came together, and she did this impression of just other students that she went to school with, and she was desperately trying to get the attention of her father, who worked a lot, who he toured a lot, was gone many months out of the year, and when he was home, he was in his studio just working. He was the boomer absent father that you could have found in any kind of other industry. He could have been a VP in an insurance company, going back to his study and nursing, a couple of highballs on his own, after work. And that's unfortunate, but she tells the story about how that song came together, and he had already kind of had this backing track made, and he said, just come into the studio and just go off. And she did it in just like a take or two, and he had a lot of fun with it. And it was a very special moment for her, a bit of a sad moment as well, because it's one of the very few times that she could connect with her father. And the song then became this cultural juggernaut, but also a major burden for her as well. I think with that song, I think any commentary, a lot of it really goes to Moon in that regard.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Hold on.
He wasn't afraid to tackle difficult subjects. We know that. Sensitive subjects, too. There was his 1984 album, Thingfish, and this was his response to Ronald Reagan's mishandling of the AIDS epidemic. You say this is a much maligned entry in his catalog. Why is that, and what are your thoughts on this album?
So I wrote this book out of order because, as I mentioned, I wasn't sure I understood it until it was finished. And how I started was I identified all the recordings and all the albums that had some kind of political commentary. And Thingfish is a difficult record. He had plans for a Broadway show, and this album is kind of the original Broadway cast recording of that. It never got made. And so the story goes that there's a part-time theater critic who works with the government to create a potion that is designed to kill gay and black people. And part of that is because those people are threats to white hegemony, but they're also specific threats to Broadway. And this theater critic who wants to keep, as he says in the lyrics, queers and natives out of Broadway and just keep it just white. And so to test this potion, they put it in the mashed potatoes at San Quentin, and it kills off a lot of gay inmates. It kills off a lot of black inmates, but also turns some inmates into these potato-headed, duck-lipped creatures. And there's a train wreck of a story that follows out of that. But as you mentioned, it was a response to Reagan's handling of the AIDS crisis. And Zappa had a particularly conspiratorial view of the AIDS crisis. He was open to the idea that it was manufactured to hurt black and gay people, the people who could be voting in elections, and wasn't really buying into official stories that it had found its way over from a sub-Saharan primate. And his basis for that, historically, was he used the album and the AIDS crisis to connect to the Tuskegee syphilis study that happened just a few decades earlier, which, for listeners who may not be familiar, Tuskegee University had invited a lot of black men, typically poor, typically sharecroppers, to do studies where many of them were infected with syphilis. And the idea was to see how syphilis would have impacted them. And these men had no idea that they were going to be infected with syphilis. They thought they were being treated for a variety of different diseases, one being just a general term called bad blood. And that went on for several decades until a journalist had found out about it and the study was shut down. And so for Zappa, America had already proven how it will treat its most marginalized communities. And so now you have this disease that's supposedly only targeting certain populations. For him, there was a lot of skepticism on just the validity of the official reports that were coming in. And it's a difficult work because not only of the subject matter, and it's also just a confusing story. Like, there's a lot of exposition that you have to go in with a lot of knowledge to even know that's what it's about. It's not very clear that's a response to the AIDS crisis because it's just this evil prince is putting this potion in mashed potatoes. But the main character, who was played by Ike Willis, a black man who was in Zappa's band at that time, the main character, the Thingfish, is essentially the Kingfish character from Amos and Andy, and he speaks in that very stereotypical slave dialect throughout the entire piece. And it's a whole album that really takes the tropes of American racism and turns it up to 11 to highlight the absurdity of it and how that absurdity still kind of infiltrates our society now. And it was one of the last chapters I wrote for the book because it was just so difficult, and I needed to learn how to kind of approach that. But it was one I could not leave out because of the commentary that is communicated on the album if I had left it out, I felt like I would have been whitewashing Zappa's legacy. It gave me an opportunity to kind of say, there is something he's trying to accomplish here. It may not be successful, but it's not rooted in racism or these other factors that are contributing to systemic racism. There's something here that he's trying to communicate, even if it may be wrong, even if it may be difficult. I couldn't let it go for my own convenience. It was an opportunity for me to really address Zappa's whiteness as a musician, my whiteness as an author, and use it as an opportunity to hopefully create more dialogue about not only that record, but Zappa's attitudes when it came to how America handled its history of racism.
Chapter 5, titled Porn Wars, the clips of Zappa defending the arts, especially rock and roll artists. I always love his appearance on CNN's Crossfire in 1986, his classic. The PMRC, talk about the Parents Music Resource Center. What was their mission, and how did Frank Zappa respond?
So the Parents Music Resource Center were a collection of the wives of affluent leaders in Washington. They were the wives of senators, of congressmen, of business leaders who were having issues with the MTV generation's exposure to sex and things that they felt were inappropriate for children. Tipper Gore has written about how she came in on her daughter listening to "Darling Nikki" by Prince and was very disturbed by the lyrics mentioning masturbating with a magazine. And so they had took their Christmas card list and just collectively put it together to create this mailing list of people they could contact who might be sympathetic to their goals in limiting the access that children could have to content that they deemed to be not acceptable. And they kind of positioned themselves to say, well, we want to have a rating system for music that, movies have. If movies have ratings, why can't music have ratings? But there's a lot of issue with that. First, there's the commercial response that as albums were being targeted for potential labeling, there were threats to companies that sold those albums. There's a report that I talk about in the book how Camelot Music had received a letter from the owner of the mall that they were in that if you sell these records, we're going to cut your lease. So there was that impact that it had on the commercial aspect, but also on the artistic aspect was that it created a freezing effect for artists and the ideas that they wanted to communicate. And Frank, in his testimony, says, effectively that, an actor is not judged really by the role that they take. No one thinks that someone that they're seeing on the movie screen, they're not thinking that's that person. But when they're listening to the album, there's kind of a different thing that's happening. We tend to think that the person singing to us is somehow endorsing certain ideas or they're saying that what they believe. There's not a lot of room for irony in that or a kind of allegory in that. So Zappa's response to this was to address potential censorship issues with the impact that could have on artists, which has been the largest aspect of his legacy regarding the PMRC. But he was also very clever in how he communicated the business element of this, because what the PMRC was doing and how they were able to accelerate so quickly with their mission was that they talked about all the sex and all the bad content in the music, but they wanted to wrap this legislation in a tax bill that was going to put a tax on blank tapes that the music industry wanted as a mitigation effort to fight piracy. That was a huge deal in the 80s. And Zappa had seen the culture war issue as being that poison pill that would get people to kind of swallow taking on a private tax that he felt that the industry should have paid themselves. I mean, if we think about today with a lot of the tariffs that are happening, who is paying for those tariffs? It's you as consumers. You're paying more for those products because these companies don't want to bear that kind of responsibility. And so he recognized that there was this kind of private tax being levied on American citizens without their consent, without their voting for it. And that was really at the heart of what his argument was. And he was right to do it because the PMRC was very limited in their scope and focus. They were only targeting rock and pop music. In the book, I talk about how a lot of representatives in the music industry and Zappa identified that no one in country music was being targeted. And it was no coincidence that one of the Senate leaders who was at the PMRC was Al Gore, who was the senator of Tennessee, and whose wife, Tipper Gore, was one of the leaders of the PMRC.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
I mean, there's like no way that we can just pause for a minute. You guys just go home and do your stuff, and then tomorrow we can just like continue.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock Podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock Podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. I wonder how much these politicians were aware of how intelligent Frank Zappa was. I wonder if they even realized what they were going up against.
You know, I don't think they had any clue. I think they had in their mind that Frank was this big wild-haired guy. By this time, he had short hair. He dressed in a suit a lot. They carried their own projections. The other two figures who had testified at that hearing were Dee Snider of Twisted Sister, and Twisted Sister was a band that was targeted by the PMRC, but also John Denver. And I had read quotes from Dee Snider that him and Frank weren't sure where John was going to be on this issue. You know, he's kind of the all-American, you know, kind of just good guy. And there's a lot of projected onto him that like, well, you know, he's going to support, you know, the PMRC because he is this wholesome guy. And he absolutely didn't. His statement is actually probably the most fiery of them all because he equates the motives of the PMRC to be like the book burnings in the Third Reich. And what's kind of fascinating about this is not only did that surprise a lot of people that John Denver was going to have that view, but there's a great oral history that a writer named, I think his name was Zach Schoenfeld, that did for the PMRC's 30th anniversary in 2015. And he interviewed a lot of the people who were there. He interviewed Candy Stroud, who was a public relations expert who supported the PMRC, Susan Baker. Gail Zappa speaks in this oral history project in lieu of Frank, who had passed away by then. And there's a quote from, I think it may be Susan Baker or someone from the PMRC, who, even though John Denver had made these comments, they still thought of him as, oh, he was just such a sweet, nice guy. But Frank, he was just so mean and just so awful. I don't have the direct quote, but they still even thought of him as very offensive, even though his position was, you know, I'm okay with printing lyrics and I'm okay with giving parents more consumer information to make informed decisions about what they expose their children to. But we need to find a way to pay for it that is not a burden to American taxpayers. And 30 years later, we've still kind of seen as the provocateur, the one, you know, the one you had to watch out for, when really, no, not at all.
When Frank Zappa passed away, there was a powerful tribute published in the New Yorker on December 20th, 1993. You cover in the book. It was just over 2 weeks after Zappa died. It was written by the Czechoslovakian activist and writer Václav Havel. He served as the last president of Czechoslovakia from 1989 until 1992. He and Zappa met in January of 1990. First, can you talk about that meeting, their relationship, and what Havel says in that tribute?
So Havel was president of Czechoslovakia until 1992. Then it became the Czech Republic. And he was an activist in the Soviet Union in Czechoslovakia who helped draft this thing called Charter 77, which was kind of a charter document of like how we democratize and make things more free. That's a very oversimplified way to describe that. So if there's any historians listening, I'm very sorry. But it was their kind of blueprint to make Czechoslovakia, and by, I guess, the rest of the Soviet Union, to be more democratic. And Zappa's music was really inspirational to a lot of those people at that time because of the messaging in his music conveying ideas of freedom. And I find that so fascinating because at that time, he's being criticized in America for juvenile lyrics, for being a novelty musician, for not really having anything intelligent to say. I've heard many times over the years, I like Frank Zappa's music, but not his lyrics. And here is a country of people who are actively being repressed, really admiring him for that. And him and Jimmy Carter were actually seen as the two biggest enemies of the state in Czechoslovakia because of what they were saying. And as the Iron Curtain was falling and Frank was kind of getting more respectable, by the late 80s, he was shifting away from rock music. His final tour was in 1988. He put out his final rock album in 88 called Broadway the Hard Way. While shifting away from that, he's getting very interested in politics, having come on the heels of the PMRC, and he's touring around Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union doing interviews on financial matters. He was in talks to have a talk show for the Financial News Network, and he had met Havel as kind of an effort in that. And he found that when he did visit Czechoslovakia, and there's great footage of it in the Alex Winter documentary, where he arrives and there's 5,000 people at the airport and they're all just cheering for him. And he never had that kind of welcome by any other audience. And it really had an effect on him. And just to be in an environment where you're appreciated, of course, you're going to want to try to be involved. And so he had meetings with Havel and another of Havel's administration to be kind of a cultural emissary, to talk about, not only how you can stimulate economic development in Czechoslovakia, but how can this economic development also elevate the culture. He was all on board to do that until Secretary of State James Baker III, whose wife Susan was on the PMRC, sent a letter saying, no, can't have Zappa do this. There will be consequences. I don't know exactly what that letter said or what exactly was communicated, but they dropped the idea of Zappa being a cultural emissary for Czechoslovakia. But when he did die of pancreatic cancer, Havel did write this beautiful obituary about just how much of a hero Frank was to so many in Czechoslovakia and how important he was in that transition and maintaining dignity for people who are looking to have the same freedoms and rights that a lot of Americans were taking for granted back home.
Booked on Rock Podcast will be back after this.
Can we go now, please, people? A good plan today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. Europe would play a significant role in Zappa's life after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it culminated in the last album he released while he was alive, which is 1993's The Yellow Shark, an album of orchestral music, 2 tracks that you say stand out as distinctly stark and bleak statements about the United States and the direction in which Zappa believed the country was heading. What are those 2 songs?
So The Yellow Shark was a series of concerts that he did in Europe in his final 2 years. I mean, he knew he was going to die, and he worked diligently. It was an opportunity for him to hear the music that he made the way he had intended it for audiences who would absolutely respect it. And these concerts were held in Berlin, Vienna, and then one more, three European countries. I'm sorry, I blanked out on what those cities were. But the orchestra was called the Ensemble Moderne, just avant-garde musical work, and did orchestral versions of it. And there's a lot of older compositions that got that kind of work. And they even did one of Zappa's Synclavier pieces, G-Spot Tornado, and turned it into a orchestral work that capped the whole concert because it was one of those pieces that Zappa believed could not actually be played by humans. So if you go on YouTube and look up G-Spot Tornado, it's an incredible performance because not only are the musicians really adept, but there's 2 performers dancing on stage, and it's just incredible. But there were some tracks on that did have lyrics, despite that the album is largely orchestral instrumental music. The first is a reading called Food Gathering in Post-Industrial America in 1992. And it's a reading by a woman named Hilary Sturt, who I think played viola or violin in the ensemble. And she's talking about a post-industrial wasteland where just just toxic goop is everywhere because all these factories have just dumped all their sludge and everything, and people are just eating foam packing pellets. But by the end of it, there are lines that there are wild abandoned children who are feasting on each other because of abortion being banned several years ago. And that's rather striking because it's a whole piece that talks about this environmental capitalist post-industrial nightmare. And it's an awful setting to be in. But by that final line and the delivery and the way that Hillary delivers that line about the total ban on abortion, you know exactly who is responsible for these conditions, for this environment. It may not be explicitly said, but it's there. And it's an incredibly powerful piece. And the other one is powerful in different ways. It's a piece called Welcome to the United States, and it's a musical reading of an immigration form. And it starts off with this German fanfare, and one of the German men in the ensemble is reading questions from this form. Did you come by land? Did you come by sea? Have you been convicted of these crimes? And as a response to each of these questions, there's some type of like musical motif that the ensemble performs. So when there's a comment, I think about espionage, there's a brief orchestral point where they play Louie Louie by the Kingsmen. I can't remember exactly where that comes in, but it's kind of funny. But at a certain point, there's questions about between 1939 and 1945, were you involved in this and that? And it's very dark, and and the music starts just turning, creating something that sounds very awful. And as he reads these questions about, were you involved in, essentially, the Third Reich and the Nazis tirade through Europe, one single solitary man at the end of this piece says yes. Then the leader of the German ensemble says, welcome to the United States. So it's a weird kind of interpretation of a document form that, with its musical cues and the German leader, is meant to kind of create this idea of this type of authoritarianism that we'd seen in Nazi Germany start to creep its way into America.
Frank Zappa, one of the most fascinating figures in music history, rock history, and in this country's history. His legacy, how are his ideals still relevant today?
Well, so a lot of what he was addressing and what my book does is to talk about how he saw the rise of white Christian nationalism in our politics. And since his death in 93, I mean, we do see a major political party having largely adopted that in their platform, and that the barriers are breaking down. I just saw on the news today that, I don't know if it's the Supreme Court, some court is ruling that churches can be able to make political demonstrations and endorse political candidates. And this is something that for 7 decades was, against the law, because that would be a violation of their tax exempt status. But now we have an administration and people in these various departments say, you know what, it's okay. Yeah, we don't have to have that anymore. And you see that increasingly more and more, these policies and these actions that are being driven by a type of evangelical Christianity that is specifically meant to elevate non-white and non-male people. And when I looked at Zappa's lyrics in the 80s, I saw that exact same kind of commentary. There's a great track from Broadway the Hard Way called Jesus Thinks You're a Jerk that I think is his masterpiece. And this is 1988. And there's lines that go, with a Ku Klux moo-moo in the back of a truck, if you ain't born again, they're going to mess you up, screaming, no abortion, no siree, life's too precious, can't you see? Well, what's that hanging in a neighbor's tree? Well, it looks like colored folks to me. And for over 40 years, he was saying that these people who are gaining more and more power, it's going to be at the expense of these marginalized groups. And to me, that is where I had this realization that Zappa was a very progressive-minded figure, and was not this conservative that, just because he has like one clip on, Crossfire where he says, well, I'm a conservative. You may not believe that. His values were at odds with conservative ideology at that time, and especially would be now.
And there's so much more to explore about this topic in your book, Frank Zappa's America, which is out now. You can find it wherever books are sold. You could also look for it at your nearest bookstore, bookedonrock.com. You could find your nearest independent bookstore. And where can people find you online, Bradley?
I'm on Blue Sky. I think it's at Bradley Morgan. I also have a Instagram where sometimes I post stuff there for the book, but mainly a lot of my author stuff is on Blue Sky. I also have my website, bradley-morgan.com. And yeah.
The book's been out since June 2nd. What type of response have you gotten?
What I have seen has been positive. I've been very curious about what the Zappa fan community is going to say, because I had some issues with them even while writing the book, that while there's a large majority of Zappa fans who recognize a lot of the characteristics that I identify in the book, there's still that, like every fandom, there's still that kind of purist subset that says that, well, we disagree with this for whatever type of reason they may be projecting. And when I was writing the book, I went to a couple forums, and I'd asked if there was any writings about Zappa from women or people of color, because I wanted to try to get as much of a non-white and non-male perspective into this book as I possibly could. And there were a lot of people who were helpful, like, oh, there's people who worked with him or played in his band. You can see clips. I wanted something that was very critical or analytical, but I did have people kind of chime in and going, why? Why do you need that for, huh? Did you blah, blah, blah? Did you know he was conservative? Taking labels out of context to project what they feel, but it's inaccurate.
Bradley Morgan, thank you so much for another amazing book. Now, people got to get this book and your book on you, too, which is another fascinating read. Thank you so much for being on, and look forward to having you back on.
Thank you, Eric. It's been a pleasure.
That's it. It's in the books.